Well, hello there. Who are you?
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Killing must feel good to God, too. He does it all the time. And are we not created in his image?
We all go a little mad sometimes.
After all, murder is, or should be, an art.
I could kill you now pretty easily. Do some interesting things before anyone showed up.
What are these films you can't wait to look at?
Welcome to the Final Girls podcast and the 7th episode of our series dedicated to on-screen serial killers of horror film history. I'm Anna Bogutska, and every episode of the series is a portrait of your podcast host. Last week, we discussed one of 2 Richard Fleischer films that we're covering on this series, 10 Rillington Place. And in this episode, I'm joined by film critic and writer Katie Rife to talk about another, The Boston Strangler from 1968, a true Hollywood oddity starring Tony Curtis as the titular killer Anton DeSalvo and Henry Fonda as the officer who catches him. The film is hugely and controversially fictionalized, so don't go looking at it for any accuracy, although it is an incredible watch, mostly done through split screen. And in the second half of the episode, Katie and I talk about Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, often considered one of the best serial killer movies of all time, and featuring a chilling central performance by Michael Rooker. We tried to make it funny, but these films are intensely violent and relentlessly bleak, so listener discretion is advised. If you want to damage your soul a bit more, you can find all of the films I'm going to be discussing during this series over on the Final Girls Letterboxd page, which I'll link in the show notes. And if you're making your way through the history of movie serial killers with me, I'd so appreciate a review of the show over on Apple Podcasts. And with all that said, please enjoy our take on The Boston Strangler and Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. You feel ready?
Yes. I'll
Okay.
blame it on the festival flu. I'll probably mention it because I don't always sound like this.
That's not fine. Also, I love a little gravelly voice. I don't know if you get the same feeling. I'm like, oh, I sound like Lauren Bacall. It's like sexy gravelly voice.
Ooh, yeah. I'll think of it that way. No, I was smoking cigarettes in Austin, and
That
it
is very
always does
Lauren
me
Bacall,
dirty.
though.
Yeah, that's true. Be like, I'm sorry, I was smoking cigarettes.
So I love to start a conversation about very dowdy horror films with a laugh. Katie, thank you so much for your time. I'm really excited to talk about these 2 films with you. But first, since it's our first time recording together, I have to ask you what I ask every single one of my guests. What is your own personal relationship with horror?
Well, so when I was a child, my family was somewhat religious, and so I wasn't allowed to watch R-rated films or MTV or anything like that. And me being me, I think it's part of my inborn personality. I wanted to know. I wasn't allowed, so I simply had to know. And my parents had one R-rated VHS tape, and it was The Shining. And I was left alone in the afternoon for a few hours after school every day. And so I've probably seen The Shining over 100 times because I would just sit and watch The Shining over and over and over again. And be like, this is the adult world. This is the world that's forbidden to me. So that's kind of how it got started. And then in my teenage years, I was a bit of a punk rocker, and that kind of led to an interest in cult films and exploitation films, which brought me back around to horror movies. And now I guess I'm a generalist with film criticism. You give me an assignment and I will review it, but my specialty is horror films.
I love this. I love the image of little Katie rewatching The Shining over and over again, like a lot of adults do in our spare time now.
I still watch it when it snows. Like if it's a real snowy day, I'll put on The Shining.
And, you know, kind of coming into the season, the type of films that I'm covering on this series of the podcast, what do you think of when you think of serial killers in movies?
Honestly, the first thing that comes to mind for me is really grimy films, really kind of realistic, grimy type of films. I don't think of like slick thrillers so much. I think about films like Seven that are really down and dirty, and, you know, and I think about a film that I saw a few years ago at Fantastic Fest that lives in my mind is called The Golden Glove, which was about Franz Hanke, I think his name was. Hanke was definitely his last name. And that was just one of the grimiest films I've ever seen. So when I think about serial killers, I think about just, you know, the gutter of humanity, which I think we're going to splash around in today a little bit.
Yes, we are. Oh my God. It's so funny you mentioned that film because I oohed and awed a lot about whether to cover it in this series or not. And I decided ultimately that maybe it was a bit too much.
Well, funny story. I did a different podcast. It was called The Unwatchables.
Oh,
and you were supposed to recommend a film that's difficult to watch. And I said, okay, I'm going to take you at your word here. And so we discussed The Golden Glove. And the host said to me, he said, this was too much for me. It was too far. And I said, your podcast is called The Unwatchables. So I took your premise seriously, you know, but I was a little bit proud of myself. You know, I try to be a gentle and kind person, but there is a edgelordy part of me that likes really offensive films. So.
Oh, wait, I think it might be a horror thing as well.
Yeah.
You know, we're told so many times over the lifespan of our fandom that there's something wrong with us because we like horror films.
Sure.
I think the edgelord vibe comes out when someone challenges your ability to find the weirder shit or enjoy it or glean something from it. I get that way whenever anyone would be like, oh, but you know, but have you seen this? Or can you recognize this? Whenever someone tries to challenge me in terms of movie knowledge.
Yeah. And then you're like, listen, I have seen X, Y, and Z. I have seen Necromantic. Like, I am real. I'm a real horror fan. Well, what's funny about that is an area of films I really, really like is kind of where art house films get so dark they kind of tip into horror films. You know, like some Michael Haneke films are this way, like The Piano Teacher or like Fat Girl, Catherine Breillat. Like that's a type of film I really like too. When the content is so extreme that it tips into horror, and you know, and then you have the I also really dig like films that have a very heightened formal style. So that's really one of my favorite type of films is dark art house.
Well, I think that, you know, if we can move into talking about both of these, both the Boston Strangler and Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer are kind of that. They're a bit too slickly made, even with the low budget of Henry, a bit too formally conscious to be full on horror films, but they're too dark to just be art house dramas or even biopics of really
or like a Hollywood drama, a Hollywood thriller, you know, like Boston Strangler has a lot of big actors of the day in it.
So let's talk about the Boston Strangler, which is a film that I admit I had not watched until I started the series. So what was your first impression of it? And obviously we're coming at it with decades of distance.
Sure. My first impression of it was that I was a little surprised by how frank some of the language was. You know, talking about, you know, just little details they put in it I wouldn't have expected to see in a film from 1968. You know, talking about rape and assault and violence and, you know, just kind of the torrid sexuality of it. Even compared to a film like, I mean, I know it was 8 years earlier, but I watched Peeping Tom recently. And even compared to Peeping Tom, I was like, oh my goodness, this is a very frank film. But I really loved the use of split screen in it. I really enjoyed that. That was my other big impression.
Yes, I had no idea that it was going to be so stylistically conscious, that it was going to play around with form and points of view so much. So I was riveted by it and kind of unsettled by the multiple perspectives.
because normally split screen that I've seen, it's, you just have two different places you're showing at the same time. I saw a film called Wicked, which was it was a murder mystery. It was from 1973, and it was shot entirely in split screen. And in that one, the way they did it was you had, it was showing two different locations, one on the left, one on the right, and it all came together at the end in the murder mystery style. And then there was also Amour. That film was shot entirely in split screen, but this film used it differently than anything I had ever seen before. Like, for example, you'd have a scene where someone comes up and rings the buzzer of an apartment building, and the split screen next to it would show the buzzer of the apartment building. Just the way that it showed different angles within the same shot using the split screen, I thought was very cool.
Yeah, and it also really showed the amount of time that was passing as the investigation kind of continued, and the wideness of that investigation, how it was really taking over the entire city of Boston, and how many different people were being affected. I think I was particularly struck when they were, approaching all the different suspects, which are mostly kind of men who were in any way on the fringes of what was considered kind of quote unquote normalcy. And you would see them kind of go about their life. There's one shot that really made me laugh of just a guy in a gym doing bicep curls, and then he was approached by a policeman. I'm like, what is this man doing? He literally is doing nothing wrong. Why is he a suspect?
Combining the two things we're talking about, the scene in the gay bar, I thought that was relatively frank for 1968, and that you knew exactly what this place was. It was a gay bar, and I believe, and that was one of the suspects they approached as being, slightly off. Who was, of course, innocent.
Yes. Well, on that note, actually, like the one thing that I think maybe we should kind of cover up front is like there is a lot of homophobic slurs in this film.
Yes.
And it's I couldn't tell you. I kept questioning myself whether the entire film was leaning into that or whether it was just showing the way that the police force was operating and how they looked at people and how they looked at gay men in particular.
I mean, I think unfortunately it's just of the era, if you watch a lot of films from the late 60s, early 70s, films that don't have anything to do with, any of these topics, they'll throw a lot of slurs around very casually.
Let's talk a little bit about Fleischer, who has made a couple of other sort of serial killer films, all of them effectively horror biopics of real life murderers. There's Compulsion, which he did prior to this film, which is about the Leopold and Loeb case, and then another film that I'm going to be covering in a future episode called 10 Rillington Place. But where do you know much of his work? Where do you think this film stands in his filmography?
I think it's interesting to be pursuing that theme in the 1960s because, if I recall correctly, the term serial killer wasn't even coined until the 1970s.
Yeah, you're right. Although, do you know much about the Boston Strangler case?
A little bit. Like, I've watched like a trashy TV documentary about it. But, I've never read any books about it or anything like that.
How do you feel, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about both of these films together is because so far I've been rewatching or covering films that are fictionalized, completely fictional. So they've either been loosely inspired by real life killers like Ed Gein with Norman Bates and so on and so forth. But these are trying, if we can discuss the accuracy of them or not, but they're using real life people, they're using real life cases. How do you think this film in particular plays with the real life case of the Strangler?
I think that it does. The thing that struck me about that most effectively from what I know about the real life case is I think it did a good job of evoking the sense of panic in the city because people were really, really freaked out about it. And I think the stylistic aspect of the film and all the editing and the fractured editing and everything really gave you a good feeling for that. And there's one scene in particular where they're chasing I believe it's Tony Curtis through an alleyway and down like some narrow streets where I felt, I felt they did a good job of establishing like a sense of place and panic, and the use of the news clips throughout the movie and things like that. I think that was very effective, and I think that it was correct in showing that a lot of the victims of the case were elderly women, and underlining that aspect of it. But the thing that I didn't really know a lot about that they really emphasized in this film was the confession scene at the end and all the talk about dissociative identity disorder.
Yeah.
That was not part of my consciousness of what this whole case was about. And so I thought it was interesting and a little surprising that they emphasized it so heavily in this film.
Well, this I find quite interesting. This is definitely a creative choice and a creative license because, and this is not one of the cases that I know that much about, but I know that was never part of the DeSalvo case. Yeah. That is a complete fiction.
Right. It was brand new to me. I was like, wait, I feel like I would have remembered this.
Yeah. And I do wonder, I know it's only 8 years past, but I do wonder if this is a little bit of a grittier update on Norman Bates and that whole exposition scene at the end of Psycho, where they're explaining essentially, a very simplified version of DID, where they're like, well, it's him and it's his mother. And here they're doing the same thing with DeSalvo. They're like, well, it's him, but it's not him. And we need to get out this other murderous personality.
Yeah. Well, DID itself is interesting because my understanding is that it was, it was first brought out as a diagnosis and then largely discredited because it was one of those things. It's sort of like the satanic panic where you had therapists who were asking leading questions and sort of leading people towards this, towards manifesting these memories or personalities that might not have actually been there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it was discredited, but I was reading something not too long ago about now it's coming back around again, and psychiatrists are saying, oh, no, wait, this is actually a real phenomenon. So just the arc of it is very interesting.
Yeah, and I wonder as well if I know it's a real disorder, but it's also one of the most cinematically common ones, Yeah. It's been presented so many times in the same way as repressed memories are a kind of a common enough not occurrence, but a common enough word even or diagnosis that we can sort of be like, oh yeah, I know what that means when I see it.
Right.
What do you make then of that interrogation scene, which is also kind of a very, two-man confrontation between two Hollywood greats, Tony Curtis and Henry Fonda, in this stark white room?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought that the acting was very much on display there, and it had some of that great editing. There were a few, cuts. For example, when Tony Curtis says he tore up some rags, and they have these quick cuts to him tearing a rag to repair a furnace, and then tearing a rag to tie the woman to the bed, and just the cutting in there, and they would zoom in and out on his face as he was talking. I really liked the way they added visual interest to the sequence by doing these cuts to kind of convey the fracturing of his memories. I thought that was pretty cool. But overall, compared to the rest of the film, I thought it was kind of an odd choice. I didn't find it to be an especially satisfying wrap up to the narrative, and switching from this very fractured split screen style to just a white room. And two actors talking back and forth to each other. I found it knocked me off my feet a little bit stylistically in a way that I wouldn't necessarily call it negative, but it was definitely unexpected. It took me by surprise.
I think we're kind of both on the same page. Maybe because this film has not really kind of been remembered, or I haven't seen it shown many times or even covered that many times. And it was such a curio for so many different reasons. Like we've mentioned, the fact that it takes these huge liberties with the actual story whilst also using a real life man and real life murders, and essentially marketing itself under the banner of this real life criminal killing spree that terrorized the whole city, but then goes off the rails. And you're right, the film which, you know, is for 2/3 of it incredibly choppy, not in a bad way, just stylistically, the way it's using split screen and editing.
The choppiness.
I loved it. Yeah, it was really, really drawn in, especially in the way that it uses that to, it avoids showing us the actual killings until a lot later, where there's a big final murder attempt from DeSalvo. But we really see the reactions of the people who find the women's bodies, as opposed to we're really spared the graphicness of those murders. Yeah,
there is one scene I remember where they call in the psychic and he recreates. He was like, she was laying like this, and he lays on the floor, and they flip over the crime scene photograph, but it's very small. It's definitely not. It's not a close up on the photograph, and I think that's the closest they show until that last attempt to like showing one of the bodies. Like you were saying, they just show people reacting to it, which, you know, speaking of Psycho and Hitchcock, you know, like what you imagine can be so much more than what you see.
Yeah. And again, like we said before, it really reinforces the sense of citywide panic and people being terrified. And actually, I remember reading about the making of this film. The city of Boston was really against the production. They wouldn't they wouldn't grant them permits if they needed to shoot in particular buildings. They were really not on board with a Hollywood production recreating the terror that they had experienced.
Is that why, you know, because I kind of noted that. Not that you need to have shots of all the famous Boston landmarks to establish that it is Boston, but there wasn't any of that. You saw back alleyways and narrow streets, and that's what they used to establish a sense of place.
Yeah, you're right. And I think it probably was because of that, because they couldn't get the permissions.
Yeah.
And we've kind of not really talked about him, but what do you make of Tony Curtis's performance? You know, we don't think of serial killer when we think of Tony Curtis, this type of character we've seen him portray on screen.
Yes, I was kind of delighted when I realized that Tony Curtis was the killer, because I'm so used to him as a romantic lead, you know? So I think it was pretty great casting, actually, because I don't know what the modern day equivalent be.
Oh my God, that's a great...
Ryan Gosling?
Well,
being a murderer?
Well, even, I mean, I know he's not a murderer in Drive, and he's very likable in his own way in Drive, but he is vicious and a killer in Drive.
Yes.
And in Only God Forgives as well. So there is a little bit of that.
A little bit of that. I thought he wasn't stretching his persona too much. He was still basically being Tony Curtis, and a lot of the kind of shock value of it came from him, you know, the casting. I thought the casting was doing a lot of the work there. He wasn't bad, but I didn't see him stretching his persona too much.
Did you really? How would you define, for listeners who maybe haven't seen a lot of Tony Curtis performances, how would you describe his persona?
I think his persona is very kind of dashing and confident. Like I said, he's a romantic leading man. And this one, you know, sometimes when you see killers portrayed in films, and even some of these sort of like wild goose chases they go on, they're squirrely little men. And Tony Curtis is not, he couldn't be a squirrely little man if he tried. That's how I would put that.
I mean, you're right. But it's interesting because I actually thought he was trying to do a lot of work, particularly in the interrogation scene. And when he was sort of recounting or remembering his urges, there was a lot of like, you know, face trembling acting. A lot of looking into the distance aggressively.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is what I imagine he, like, very classically handsome, old school Hollywood dashing leading men would think that a killer should look like on screen.
See, he's still within the mold of the dashing leading man, even when he is trying his best. I mean, not that he wasn't frightening. There is something, you know, there are real life cases, you know. I mean, the eternal debate, was Ted Bundy actually hot? or was he just a white man in the 70s? But a lot of the kind of like public buzz around that was like, oh my God, this good-looking white man was a murderer. You know, it's got that Ted Bundy type of effect to it.
I do think the film also like keeps him away because we don't see him until about an hour in. Like I knew he was in it, I knew who he played, but we don't really get to see his face until a good way into the film. And I wanted to ask you because obviously this it's not, you know, so much a part of my cultural fishbowl really, for lack of a better word, but the assassination of JFK plays such a huge role in this film, and it really took me by surprise just how much importance is placed on it. Kind of how did you read that?
Well, I thought that it would have been especially a big deal in Boston because, you know, Kennedy was the first Irish Catholic president, and it's a very Irish Catholic city. And so him being assassinated would have hit Boston especially hard. I just know from my parents telling me that it was huge. It was a huge event. Like, you know, basically the whole country stopped for a few days to kind of reckon with the whole thing. So it made sense to me that it would have been such a big event, particularly in the context of Boston. I think it's interesting that DeSalvo takes advantage of the fact that no one's paying attention.
I think it's almost like like an extra reminder of how, you know, demonic and uncontrollable his behavior is, that even in a day of national mourning, he goes out on the prowl to kill.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the richer psychological beats in the film, too, because it shows how this man, when he feels any kind of distress, that he takes it out on these women, you know? He can't feel his feelings, and so except through violence basically. So he's upset by Kennedy being assassinated, and so he channels that into murdering a woman because of the repression. The Catholic repression, perhaps.
It was the Catholics all along.
It's always the Catholics.
It's capitalism and Catholics. That's what we can blame for all of our wrongs. So, and before we move into Henry, what did you make of the ending, particularly the use of the slightly moralistic end credits?
I screenshotted the slide about, you know, our journey. Let me pull it up real quick. I posted it on my Instagram stories because I was so tickled by this ending title card. It just made me laugh.
Please.
This film has ended, but the responsibility of society for the early recognition and treatment of the violent among us has yet to begin. It just struck me as so insincere. And also, like, they didn't quite know how to end the film. And so they're like, we'll put a title card up. It'll be fine. It just struck me so funny. I screenshotted it and put it on my Instagram stories because I was so tickled by it.
I think I thought that my TV was, like, glitching or something. Because I was like, no, this is not how it ends, isn't it?
Yeah. I think on the whole, I liked this film. Like, I did admire some of the filmmaking and acting merits of the interrogation scene, but I think I liked this film more before the interrogation scene, despite it having this sort of trust and admiration for police, which is frankly unwarranted.
I mean, one of my favorite lines that I scoffed at audibly was when one of the police officers was like, "Police brutality, we don't do that anymore."
Right after beating a guy senseless. Yeah. Right. Exactly. I wrote that down too.
I wrote down a big as if next to it.
Right.
But yeah, it's what I think you could call a propaganda movie in so many ways. Like, absolutely. The police are 100%. You know, the moral force. They're there. They're even kind of showing compassion to the serial killer, but not to the gay men that they're harassing in bars and gyms, wherever they, you know, congregate in the late 60s in Boston.
Oh, I was going to say, and I think that I don't know if the film is necessarily aware of that or commenting upon that. I think that's an interesting tension within true crime as a whole, where if you look at a lot of these stories are about, on a lot of levels, the incompetence of police and how police don't really care about, certain types of people. There's a term called the less dead, which is referring to, for example, when like a sex worker gets murdered or a trans woman or a black woman, their cases are just not investigated in the same way as they are, for example, like an upper middle class white woman. Yeah. Like her murder would be investigated much more thoroughly. And I think that you can read true crime as being anti-cop in that way, except it's not framed that way a lot of the time. I think you can frame it that way, but most of the time it is like you see in this film about like, well, thank goodness the police were there to catch the killer, But really, I think the real story is how long it usually takes them to catch them, through incompetence or indifference or whatever.
Totally. And also there is one figure that keeps coming up in these films and will continue to come up, which is this obsessed detective. Yeah. In this case, Henry Fonda, and I think that's, I'm not sure I see this film's influence particularly in other serial killer movies, but or in horror in general, but this figure, kind of this moral force for good who will not relent in the search for this killer, who needs to apprehend him and look him in the eyes and see kind of, quote unquote, the evil. That is very much at the heart of the final act, even the casting of Henry Fonda, as kind of this the white knight figure in classic Hollywood movies as well. Yep. Rarely cast as in villainous roles. And their face to face at the end is basically that. It's that that meeting of two obsessive minds that is such a through line in all of these films.
It carries through to now. It's such a trope.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's the Boston Strangler, but let's move on to another one. Let's move on to Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, which I think you have a deeper love for. What's your relationship with this film?
Well, it was shot in Chicago, and I live in Chicago, and we don't have a ton of horror movie, cornerstones in this town. So, obviously I'm fond of it for that. I went and found, at one point in the film, they mentioned Henry and Otis's address, and I went and found it. And now when filmmaker friends come to town, I take them on the Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer tour.
Wait.
Because I also found the kind of underpass where they pull off the side of the highway. Yes, Anna, if you ever come to Chicago, we can go on a Henry tour.
I am going to Chicago.
Oh, well, I'll take you to some very grim film locations.
Great. The murder tour with Katie Rife.
Yay, the murder tour. We can also go to the apartment building from Child's Play, the apartment building from Bound. Listen, I have I'm working on it.
I did not realize that Child's Play is set in Chicago. Is it?
Oh, yes. Yes, it is. The original one.
Oh my God. So as a side note, my partner and I are watching a ton of Chicago movies in preparation for this trip. He refused to watch Henry with me.
Yeah.
But now I'm going to make him watch Child's Play.
And then we'll go to the apartment building. It's pretty great. You have to, if you stand at a certain angle, it looks exactly the same as the original one sheet poster.
So what is?
Don't worry, I'll pull it up on my phone. Sorry, that was such a diversion. I'm sorry.
No, I love it.
So this film itself, like I was saying up top, I acknowledge that this is a me thing, but I kind of enjoy really dark, grim films that are very grimy and real and heavy. It's just something that appeals to me. I couldn't tell you why. I have a theory. It's because I watch a lot of horror films, and so I might be somewhat desensitized, and so I may need heavier drug, so to speak. Films like Henry are about the hardest film drug that you can take. So I wouldn't say I love this movie, but I really appreciate this movie, and I find it genuinely upsetting, which is hard to do. And so I have a lot of respect for this film, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree in the choice of those terms. It's a movie that's hard to love, but it's very easy to appreciate.
Right, exactly.
What do you find upsetting about Henry?
The most upsetting sequence in this entire film, I think the way that John McNaughton, the director, incorporates realism into it in the shooting style, particularly the scene I'm thinking of, where there is a scene where it is supposed to be home video footage of Henry and Otis breaking into a house and attacking, I believe, the couple that lives there. And the way that it is posited as real footage, as if you're watching a snuff film, is very, very upsetting because of the realism of it.
I think the low budget element of this film actually works in its favor because it makes everything feel like you found actually like the homemade video from both Otis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas.
Which has this cursed quality to it, you know? It's like something you're not supposed to see.
And tell me, what is the reputation of this film? Because this sits kind of comfortably between, you know, a low budget art movie or an art horror movie and horror.
I mean, I think that this film sort of occupies a space, like you were saying, between art horror and what I would call like underground horror, which are films that I don't particularly enjoy, like the nichest of niche interests. You know, these were big in like the 2000s, which were like August Underground is an example of this type of film. I believe that one was from the 80s.
Yeah, it was.
Where they're ostensible snuff films. They're not actually snuff films, but they're presented as such. I think that this kind of occupies a place between like a Lars von Trier or Michael Haneke movie and one of those like faux snuff films. It lives in the space between there, and so that makes its appeal pretty limited, but maybe not quite as limited as the faux snuff films.
What's its reputation amongst horror fans, would you say?
I think that I don't know. It's hard for me to say. In my mind, it's one of the more, it's like a horror fan's horror movie. It's one that you wouldn't recommend to casuals. You know what I mean? Like someone who's like, oh, I don't know. I mean, I don't really, it's not a beginner's horror film. It's sort of like for, my friend Will always says, for heads only. Yeah. And I think that Henry is kind of for heads only, meaning that only if you're already deeply into this stuff will it be a film for you.
It's interesting that whenever you Google serial killer movies or kind of look at one of those lists, and even on the recent, there was a recent re-release of the film on Blu-ray, they kind of claim it as the best serial killer movie of all time. And I think
possibly, I mean, it premiered at the Chicago International Film Festival, I know, and at that festival, I believe some critic. It was wildly divisive, as I recall. Like some critics called it just complete trash. There was just no reason for it to exist. It's exploitative trash, and others gave it 5 stars and said it was a masterpiece.
Yeah. And how does the film portray Henry and his compulsion to kill?
Well, the thing that I enjoy about this film, again, enjoy is an interesting word, but a thing I appreciate about this film is it shows a serial killer not as a devious mastermind. You know, you think about a film like Seven and it's a criminal genius. But the reality of it is most of the time they're closer to the characters of Henry and Otis in this film, which are just sort of losers. Again, it's not quite the precise word, but it's what comes to mind. You know, they're not geniuses. They are just blunt, violent, possibly lead poisoned men.
Yeah, they're not. They're not particularly interesting.
No, they're not particularly smart.
No,
they're kind of gross.
They're really gross, I'd say.
Yeah,
they're kind of just these like blunt, like you said. I think blunt is a really good word for both of them. They're kind of just drifting,
blunt objects, you know.
Yes, blunt objects drifting from the world and through the world, and occasionally colliding violently with other people.
Yeah, exactly. And something interesting, you know, like Henry seems kind of proud of what he does, and he wants to initiate Otis into this lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And that ties into reality in an interesting way, in that the real Henry Lee Lucas claimed to have murdered hundreds of people.
Yes.
And then it found out later that he was just making it up to get, you know, snacks and drinks. From the cops, because when he confessed to things, they gave him little treats.
Totally. Oh my God. Henry Lee Lucas, the original treats.
Yeah. He just wanted to,
you know,
it's more
treat.
fun. It's more fun to be in an interrogation room than it is to be in actual prison, I suppose. so, you know, like the kind of like, and that's a contemptible thing to do. And these are contemptible characters. They really have no redeeming qualities whatsoever.
They really don't. I think this is kind of one of the things that makes it difficult to love or even enjoy Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, because you're just watching and you'd be like, I just don't want to be here. I don't want to look at these guys.
Well, that's what's interesting about another thing that you know, I kind of ironically appreciate about this film is that it makes Chicago is kind of a piece with their whole, you know, the city is also a grimy, unpleasant place where you don't want to be, which is kind of amusing to me as a resident, I would say.
And how would you describe?
It's actually very nice here.
Listen, I've been looking at so many Chicago movies and YouTube videos of Chicago. It looks lovely. Can't wait to visit.
It is, but not in this film. Not in this film. It is like a dirty, violent, bestial, grim place in this film.
And both of them are, you know, Henry and Otis are kind of stalking the city in a way. But they don't really belong to the city because they're drifters. You know, they just kind of come in and decide to kill a bunch of people, but they can easily as well leave. It doesn't really hold any sort of relationship to them. There's nothing tying them down there.
Yeah, not really. I mean, Becky comes. I'm not sure exactly, but it's implied that Becky is Otis's sister, and it's implied that they're from like Tennessee or Kentucky. They're from further south, it's implied, and that Becky came up to try to get work. And so she's kind of the only thing tying them to the city. And even so, she just drifted in too, you know? And I believe Otis is on parole, so he can't go anywhere.
Well, doesn't stop him though. I mean, technically, you're not supposed to murder people when you're on parole either, but you know.
True, yeah, they're not supposed to be doing a lot of things that they do in this film. Good point.
And you know, the presence of Becky is quite interesting. Kind of what role does she play in their story? How does she exist between them?
I mean, I think like thematically in the grand scheme of the film, she's like an innocent to be debased, you know, because innocence can't last long in this world. And, you know, she's just like a nice girl. She just came to town. There's a part where she buys a t-shirt that says Chicago on it. She gets a job as a hairdresser. You know, she kind of has optimism that this whole situation is going to work out for her. And she kind of has a crush on Henry. Like she's just, she's innocence to be defiled is what I think the role that she really plays in this film.
God, how bleak.
It is.
What do you think? You know, we were talking earlier about Tony Curtis, but he was a massive Hollywood star. Michael Rooker was not. What do you think about his performance and the way that he embodies Henry?
I mean, it adds to the realism of it all. You know, he's really, I mean, the word that comes to mind is hard. you know? Like, he's kind of muscular and he wears these tank tops and his jaw is set really, really tight. And he has this really hard stare. It kind of goes along with that blunt object thing we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. He has like a hammer-like presence in the film.
Yeah.
Like at any point, he'll just fall on you and absolutely fuck you up.
Yeah, right. Like he could just explode into violence at any second.
Yeah.
But
I find it interesting the way that this film, it's really graphic, and I think when it starts, you see kind of these set pieces, really stylized murder scenes before we even meet Henry. What do you think of the way that the film stylizes violence?
I think that it's all kind of part of this descent into depravity that we're having in this film. That it starts off more stylized before getting more visceral and real. It's like at first you can have a little bit of distance because of the stylization, but as it goes along, it's almost implicating you in their actions.
And I there's also, I think it's a part of this almost fantastical element of Henry, because we don't get any fantasy in the film at all. It's unrelentingly bleak, but knowing that the real life Henry Lee Lucas was a fantasist for a little treat, I was wondering watching this, like, is this the way that the film is almost hinting at the fact that he may have made up the extent of his murders or
that's interesting.
The violence of them.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't think about it that way. I wonder how much they knew about him in 1986, though.
That's right.
Like, when did it come out that he was making all this up, I wonder?
So he was apprehended in 83, which means that the film came out only 3 years after he was caught by the police. He had been in and out of the prison kind of for a while, but this is when he was apprehended for the murders. And I mean, I imagine there's a big element of fantasy here, filling in the gaps. But knowing that he was making a lot of this shit up, I think at one point he said that he had murdered like 400 people, which just was not
exactly.
true.
Well, I see here that there was an article in the Dallas Times-Herald in 1985 discrediting a lot of the murders. So I think you may be onto something because, by the time this film was made, it was known who this person was. Well, it was very current because the film came out in 86. So it was all kind of happening around the same time. He was arrested. He claimed to have killed hundreds of people. And then journalists started expressing doubts about this all around the time that this film was being written and shot.
And I think even without knowing any of that, the thing that makes me think that is because that home video that they take of themselves assaulting this couple in their house, of this home invasion, that is so messy and unplanned and kind of really, really violent and thrashing, and all of the very heavily stylized, almost set designed murders that we see before that just seem a bit too polished, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, compared to that. Yeah, maybe it's like that. Like that is what he thinks he is, and then what we see on the home video is what he really is.
Yes.
Well, that kind of goes along with the whole project of the film, which is de-glamorizing this figure of the serial killer,
Because it really does de-glamorize him, doesn't it? There really is nothing grand about Henry or Otis.
No, they're just... they're lead poisoned, like I said. They're just idiots. They're just violent idiots. There's no grand genius. There's no mystery. There's no... You wouldn't want to delve into them and find out what makes them tick because there's really nothing there.
No, and what do you make of the final confrontation and the ending when Henry kills Otis and then sets off with Becky?
Oh, this is one of the saddest. Oh my God. The ending of this film is so bleak because, we were talking about the character of Becky has this innocence to be defiled, and it happens in the most upsetting way, just so upsetting. And then you give her this tiny little bit of hope.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems like one of the cruelest things that this movie does. The ending of this movie is very, very bleak. That's my main thought on it. When I think about it, I'm just like, whew, you know?
Honestly, I'd forgotten that ending. And that whole
it's
scene.
So dark.
And then it just ends. Because when they run away together and Becky's like, I love you, Henry. Girl, no. But
Girl, no. After all of this, you still think that this man is going to protect you? You know? Like,
but also, he tells her, I guess I love you too. Which, frankly...
Oh, it's so... I know. Oh. I guess I love you too.
I think that's the worst part of the film.
It's so cruel to Becky. It's just like nothing good can survive in this world, you know?
And then when you know, I had forgotten about the ending of this film, but we don't see her be murdered. We just see Henry dumping a bloody suitcase on the side of the road.
Yeah, it's gotta be her though. It has to be her. And that's just the punchline to a very, very dark joke.
And, you know, looping both of these films in together, they're both heavily fictionalized biopics of real-life serial killers. Do you think, or kind of, you know, did any of these films make you wonder about what sort of responsibility sort of fictional horror films or dramatizations of real-life killings hold? I'm not talking about the whole true crime content, but rather kind of straight up horror films or fiction that is based on these people and using their real names and real crimes.
I mean, I'm not especially concerned with like the dignity or privacy of serial killers, to be honest.
Fair.
Fair. That part I'm relatively unconcerned with. I think, you know, I think we've kind of touched on both these things so far in the recording, but on the whole, I would say that the Boston Strangler is more unethical than Henry in a way because of the whole propaganda element.
Yeah.
And the idea that everything is going to be okay if you just trust patriarchal authority. Whereas I think that Henry, as bleak and violent and pessimistic as it is, it doesn't give you false hope, I guess, or it doesn't encourage, because there are no cops in this movie either.
None. Not at all.
No.
It's fully committed to Henry's point of view.
Right. And so in a way, I think that combined with the idea of de-glamorizing the idea of the serial killer, in a way, I think Henry is the more ethical film.
I don't think Henry Portrait, a serial killer, has ever been accused of being ethical, but I see what you mean.
Again, some of these words are not adequate. Enjoy. Ethical.
They're adequate within context.
Yes, but I definitely wouldn't want you to isolate that audio for sure.
Absolutely not.
Thank you.
Before we wrap up, Katie, is there anything about either one of these nasty, grimy little films that you wanted to touch upon that we haven't mentioned?
I don't think so. I just want to encourage you to come on the Henry Locations tour when you come to town. I'm really into it. I'm really into putting together the Chicago Horror Movie Locations tour.
I think you should. What other Chicago horror stops would you include on that tour?
Well, Poltergeist 3 takes place in Chicago. The Relic takes place in Chicago. And these aren't horror films, but, you know, they're sort of in the genre space. Thief. There's some locations for Thief. And then Bound, the Wachowski film.
Yes.
You can go and visit that apartment building as well.
And Candyman, obviously.
Yeah, Candyman. But this is what the new Candyman is about. They tore down that whole area and put like gentrified condos on top of it. There's a Target. Like, I'm not even joking. The site of where they shot Candyman, there's a Target there now.
Well, so that's disappointing.
I know, it's almost as bleak as Henry, isn't it? in its way.
Katie, thank you so much for your time.
Capitalism.
Capitalism, Catholics, cops.
Yeah, no good.
None of that. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. I was really excited to do this one. I just love you and respect your work. So this is a real treat for me.